Happy Wednesday. Welcome back to Prices at the Pumps on SaltWire, our weekly look at all things energy related. Scott Squires, pleased to be joined as always by the energy expert Dan McTagg. And Dan, let's get right to it. Prices at the pumps are set in the Atlantic region tomorrow in Newfoundland and Labrador, and then the rest of the region on Friday. From your best guesstimates, what are we looking at when we go fill up over the next couple of days, Dan?
Well, if you're in Newfoundland, Labrador, hold off gassing up because it's going to drop about 2.3 cents a liter for gasoline. And I would expect diesel and home heating fuel to drop about 1.6 cents a liter. So good news if you can hold on. Nothing crazy, but at least heading in the right direction. Again, considering that we're past the Memorial Day long weekend in the United States, that's pretty significant. Now, for the rest of Atlantic Canada, look for a similar decrease, probably about 2 cents a liter for gasoline and about 1.4 cents for PEI, Nova Scotia, and of course New Brunswick. But as I mentioned, it is odd that we see price decreases as we're now heading into what is now the summer demand season. And of course, more people are taking to the road. So let's take advantage of these while we can. The market is very nervous and panicked over interest rates. And that's a good thing for consumers.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe expand on that a little bit if you can, Dan, because conventional wisdom would tell us that prices maybe should be edging up, but they've kind of been creeping down the last couple of weeks, at least in the Atlantic region and perhaps right across Canada as well. But maybe dig into a little more on the reasoning of that and why we're seeing it and how long it might continue.
Well, the world is upside down. There is absolute panic and fear among energy traders who really aren't all about energy. They actually look at the stock market. These are stock market traders who have a lot of liquidity. In other words, they have a lot of leverage, and they have been, in my view, distorting markets, not reflecting realities of supply and demand. You and I, Scott, have talked about this over the past few weeks. And while it's a good thing because it means lower prices, it also tends to create a distortion in the market that could lead to even fewer people wanting to supply that market. Now, of course, there are a number of factors that go into that, but we're just on the eve of another OPEC digital meeting. It won't be done in person, at which there is going to be an expectation that they will maintain their production cuts, even though countries like Canada may now have 590,000 barrels a day because we finally got one pipeline built for the first time in God knows how long. Through the Trans Mountain expansion, and countries like Guyana are starting to pick up steam. Having fully willing to ensure their new finds off their coast are in fact yielding a lot more oil. Despite all of this, demand globally for the product is going to continue. I know that some people saying, well, hey, guess what? If we have all EVs, that won't happen. But EVs too, the mining, the processing, the rare earth minerals, all of these things require that they be extracted and processed. And guess what? That isn't done with pixie dust. That's done actually with hydrocarbons, oil. So earlier this week, there was an interesting point, I think put out by, was it either Reuters or it may have been one of the investment banks in the United States that said there is no scenario where demand for oil drops before at least 2040. So that's still another 15, 20 years away. It looks like markets are going to continue to ignore these things, but we could be looking at a significant crunch period, and that will happen this summer, not just because there could be hurricanes or unusual weather that disrupts, but because fundamentals are not being respected by a market that seems to be finding every excuse it can to avoid what is important for price discovery. That's a serious and sober look at demand, which is very strong in the United States. The labor market alone points that out. And supply, which of course is, always trying to play catch up at a time in which demand continues to surge.
And Dan, I was having a discussion with someone the other day about just how much oil Canada has in reserve. I believe it's the fourth largest oil reserve or oil supply in the world. Maybe for those who don't understand what Canada has in terms of that natural resource and why we're not taking advantage of it, the former parliamentarian, Dan, put your head on and explain that to me, please.
Well, it's ironic and a little contradictory that we have policies around the world which basically, and in particular in Canada, which are targeting the restriction of oil supply. And while people are concerned that there may be games played south of the border, the U.S. Justice Department and FTC may be looking into collusion by some oil companies. The irony isn't lost on Canadians who say to Americans, if you're so worried about oil prices and worried about the restriction, why in goodness name would you have stopped a Keystone pipeline that would have brought you 890,000 barrels of heavy oil that you desperately need for the very thing that runs your economy and could have prevented the inflation in part on things like jet fuel, on transport, on farm equipment, on mining equipment, the stuff in which you run your economy. Canada has the ability to service the world with energy, oil, gas that is done to the highest international standards by any measure. And I know some people say, oh, it's heavy, it's dirty. Look, you need heavy oil in order to produce the things that keep your economy running. Diesel is the best example. No diesel, no economy, no world economy. Things would come to a grinding halt. There is no substitute for that. Now, having said all that, you have in Canada this policy that says, yeah, well, maybe we might at some point down the road, but this will be the last pipeline that we built. In the meantime, let's do a list of all of the global leaders who come to Canada saying, we'd love to have some of your resources, natural gas to be sure, but oil as well. Germany, Greece, South Korea, Japan. We also have countries at Latvia who've asked for the same thing, much smaller countries, but we consider these to be, important friends of Canada. And they look and say, you have the third largest reserves in the world, bigger than the United States, bigger than any other country, including Iran. You're much bigger than Russia. The only countries that have a larger reserve are, well, let's put it bluntly, basket case Venezuela, which has destroyed its infrastructure and discouraged through socialism the kind of stuff we seem to be employing here to some extent here in Canada, discouraged any investment. And then you have Saudi Arabia, that is really the swing producer. There's no doubt Saudi Arabia has more than we do, and Venezuela is number one. But Canada being number three, in a pivotal position of being able to provide that, not just with one, but two actual recourses to the Atlantic and to the Pacific. Few countries are blessed with that kind of geography. So it is absolutely mind-boggling, to say the least, that a country like Canada would try to pretend, and I see ministers in the federal cabinet like Seamus O'Regan going around pretending that hydrogen is the way of the future. It's not. Hydrogen is extraordinarily expensive to make. A lot of other people can make it, by the way. You don't have to have an energy-based resource to do that. But to say you can go in debt some 5, 6 billion, 7 billion bucks when you have in Newfoundland, for instance, oil reserves that are larger than Norway's, which sits on a $2.2 trillion sovereign wealth fund because they've been able to exploit that. Yeah, they can do all sorts of green stuff because they have the money to do it. In the meantime, poor Newfoundland has to go cap in hand because you have a federal government that says no to any type of exploitation of resources. That's why, of course, Equinor packed up and left. For a province that has 9.1% unemployment, that's an absolute shame. But don't take my word for it. I think the by-election you saw provincially at Baie-Verte says everything. I think the people of Newfoundland are finally waking up, smelling the coffee, and realizing this is not acceptable.
Always so many things to talk about, Dan, and it's great to have your insights to be able to wade through some of those topics and things to talk about. Before we wrap up with you here, is there anything else that you're seeing either nationally, internationally, globally, that we should keep an eye on over the next few weeks?
I think we're going to watch what happens this weekend in Vienna. Let's see what happens as far as the OPEC's decision as to whether or not it maintains production cuts. There's no doubt that it will do so. Some are suggesting maybe it'll abandon that. No way. But there may be an additional further cut to be able to underline to really dysfunctional markets that if you're going to disobey the laws and fundamentals of supply and demand, then maybe we're going to cut even more oil production and really send a signal that could, set the goal of seeing oil moving back to $90 a barrel versus where it's struggling today for WTI at 79, and of course Brent at 84.
And Dan, before we do wrap up with you here in a second, Obviously, you're in your vehicle. It's another edition of Mobile Dan on Prices at the Pumps. Where are you?
I'm in Toronto right now, going to make my way to Mom's place. This is her 2016 Dodge Journey. Very good little vehicle, 4-cylinder, needed some work done. So, yes, I don't just talk energy. I do a lot of my own mechanical work as well. So, no, I don't have a shingle, and I'm not a mechanic, but I do enough to try to make sure that everybody's looked after. And every day you look at these things, a penny pinched is definitely a penny earned.
Well, Dan, being the good son, say hi to your mom for us. And before we do finally sign off, when you're not with us here at SaltWire, which we're glad to have you each and every week, but where else can folks find you? Where can they connect with you?
Well, they can find me, of course, president at affordableenergy.ca. That's email. And of course, the affordableenergy.ca is a site on some of the policy work that I've been doing, especially on EVs of late. You can also look at some of my work on X at Gas Price Wizard. And of course, all of those things allow you interaction. Let's just keep it respectful, though, because I can go only so much when I have several trolls and fools. I don't suffer them very well, nor should they expect me to.
Well, Dan, we appreciate having you here as always. Enjoy the rest of your day. Again, say hi to your mom. Have a great weekend ahead, and we'll reconvene and do this again next week.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me, Scott.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Dan.
Bye now.